I really think that we've just been able to encapsulate the amount of difference in not only in my voice but in the kind of person I've become over these past.
Picture a 17-year-old boy standing under studio lights, wearing a t-shirt he probably regretted the second the cameras cut to him. He's been bullied since he could walk. He's overweight, awkward, and visibly terrified. One of the most famous judges on television looks at him and says, almost under his breath, that things couldn't possibly get worse. And then the boy opens his mouth, and the entire room forgets how to breathe. That boy was Jonathan Antoine, and what happened after that moment is a far stranger, sadder, and more inspiring story than most people realize. Today we're going deep into the real journey of Jonathan Antoine, the audition that changed his life, the partner he lost, the diagnosis that explained everything, and where he actually is right now. It was the 24th of March, 2012, and Britain's Got Talent was in the middle of its sixth series. Backstage, two teenagers from Essex were waiting to walk out in front of Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, and the rest of the panel. Jonathan Antoine was 17. His singing partner, Charlotte Jaconelli, was 16. They billed themselves, at least at first, as Charlotte and Jonathan, a classical crossover duo that nobody in that building expected to be any good. The judges certainly didn't expect it. Simon Cowell reportedly greeted Jonathan's entrance with a dry, dismissive line about things not being able to get any worse. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was showmanship, the kind of setup reality television loves, where the audience is primed to laugh before they're allowed to be amazed. But underneath the format, there was a real kid, someone who had spent his entire life being underestimated and mocked for the way he looked, now standing in front of millions of people bracing for one more rejection. Then the first notes of the prayer filled the room. It's the Andrea Bocelli and Celine Dion duet, a song built for exactly this kind of moment, and Jonathan's tenor voice cut through the auditorium with a depth and control that simply didn't match his age. Charlotte's clearer, more contemporary voice wove around his. Within seconds, the skepticism on the judges' faces evaporated. By the time the song ended, the audience was on its feet, and Cowell, the very man who'd greeted Jonathan with a backhanded joke minutes earlier, was comparing his voice to Luciano Pavarotti. It's one of those rare television moments that actually earns the word viral. The clip spread everywhere, racking up millions of views and turning two anonymous Essex teenagers into overnight news. There was a strange twist buried in that same audition, though. Cowell, clearly floored by Jonathan's voice specifically, suggested on air that Jonathan should drop Charlotte and go it alone, that she might hold him back. It's a wild thing to say to two kids who'd been singing together since school, live, on national television. They stayed a duo anyway, advancing through the competition, the semi-final on the 7th of May, where they performed Lucio Dalla's Caruso, and the final on the 12th of May, where they returned to the prayer and earned another standing ovation. They didn't win. Ashley and Pudsey, yes, a dog act, took the title that year, and Jonathan and Charlotte finished second. Jonathan has since described the sensation of losing as something like his organs sinking, though he didn't break down on stage. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because losing to a dancing dog sounds almost like a joke, a punchline people still bring up more than a decade later. But for two teenagers who had poured everything into that performance, it was a real and public disappointment, delivered in front of an audience of millions. Here's where the story takes its first real turn. Second place turned out to be remarkably lucrative. The very next day, Simon Cowell was already negotiating a recording contract, and by the 13th of May, 2012, it was confirmed Jonathan and Charlotte had signed a deal with Cowell's label, Psycho, reportedly worth around £1 million. Losing the competition and winning the prize turned out not to be mutually exclusive after all. Their debut album, Together, arrived that September in the UK, followed by an October release in the United States. It performed well, landing in the UK top 5 and selling in the hundreds of thousands. Critics were kind to Jonathan specifically, describing his tone as rich and almost velvety, remarkable for someone still a teenager. ITV followed the pair with documentary cameras, capturing tours through France and Italy, coaching sessions with people connected to Pavarotti's own vocal training, and, in a nice bit of closure, an on-camera apology from Cowell for suggesting, months earlier, that Jonathan should ditch his partner. For a while, it genuinely looked like a fairy tale. But the cracks were already forming underneath the polish. Their second record, Perhaps Love, released in October 2013, again reached the UK top 5, but it told a quieter story if you looked closely. The album leaned more into contemporary covers, songs from Florence and the Machine and the film Once. And notably, it included solo tracks from each of them. Charlotte was drifting toward musical theater. Jonathan wanted to stay rooted in classical and operatic material. Two teenagers who'd been thrown into international fame together were starting to want genuinely different things, and there's nothing unusual or dramatic about that. It's just what happens when two people grow up in public and discover they're not growing in the same direction. On the 2nd of February, 2014, it became official. Jonathan and Charlotte were done as a duo. They'd sold more than 250,000 albums together. They had an entire fan base built around their partnership, nicknamed the Fantoins. And now both of them had been offered individual solo deals with Sony Classical, and both were taking them. Their joint statement tried to frame it warmly: gratitude for the journey since meeting at school, excitement about their individual futures. But plenty of outlets ran with a Messier version of events, suggesting a more one-sided breakup than the press release let on. Years later, Jonathan gave a more grounded explanation, essentially saying that Charlotte had helped build the confidence that got him onto that stage in the first place, but that neither of them had ever really been ensemble performers at heart. They loved solo work. There's only so far a crossover duo can stretch, he suggested, before it either has to reinvent itself or split. In a strange way, it validated the very thing Cowell had said back in the audition, however clumsily he'd said it. What followed wasn't a dramatic falling out so much as a slow drift into silence. By 2017, Jonathan admitted in a television interview that the two barely spoke anymore, chalking it up to the demands of the industry rather than any grudge. Charlotte, for her part, had said around the split that ending the musical partnership didn't mean they'd stop being friends. But that's not quite how it played out. Two people who'd known each other since 2006, who'd built a genuinely unlikely dream together, ended up largely estranged. For what it's worth, both have been consistent over the years that they were never a couple, despite plenty of fans shipping them hard during their run on the show. Charlotte has referred to Jonathan more like a brother than anything romantic. To really understand why that BGT moment mattered so much, you have to go back further, long before the standing ovations. Jonathan Antoine was born in January 1995 in Hainault, Essex, to a police inspector father and a mother who stayed home to raise the family. And from an almost unbelievably young age, around 4 years old, he was being bullied. Not the occasional playground teasing kids brush off, but sustained, cruel targeting over his weight and his appearance that followed him for years. Like a lot of kids in that situation, he found comfort in the two things that felt safe: food and music. The music side of that equation changed everything. At 11, he enrolled at West Hatch High School in Chigwell, and it was there he met a singing coach named Jenny Ewington, who recognized something in him that the other kids, and maybe Jonathan himself, hadn't fully seen yet. She worked with him on pieces from Oliver and classical repertoire like Panis Angelicus, and slowly, word started to spread around school that there was a kid with an extraordinary voice hiding behind all that bullying. By 14, Jonathan auditioned for all 4 of London's major music conservatories and was accepted into every single one, eventually choosing the Royal Academy of Music's junior program. In 2010, he performed Bring Him Home from Les Miserables at a regional music festival and scored a mark that stood as the highest in that festival's history. A year later, he sang Ave Maria at the Royal Festival Hall in London. By the time he walked onto the BGT stage in 2012, he wasn't some undiscovered fluke. He was a genuinely trained young tenor who had simply never had a spotlight big enough to match his talent. The bullying and the years of self-doubt were real, but so was the discipline underneath them. Going solo after a partnership that famous is a real gamble. Audiences don't always follow one half of a duo the way they followed the pair. Jonathan's answer to that question came in October 2014 with his debut solo album, Tenore, Italian for tenor. It shot to #1 on the UK's classical artist album chart. making him the youngest tenor ever to top that particular chart, and it even cracked the general pop top 15. Reviewers were generous, with one calling him a genuine new star on the vocal scene. The record leaned into powerful classical material, including a rendition of Panis Angelicus that echoed back to those early lessons with Jenny Ewington. That same year brought an endorsement that's hard to overstate. Placido Domingo, one of the most famous tenors alive, personally invited Jonathan to perform as his guest at the iTunes Festival. Jonathan also crossed the Atlantic that year, performing at the Muhammad Ali Celebrity Fight Night events across Arizona, California, and Florida, quietly building an American fan base independent of the British talent show narrative that had launched him. His second solo album, Believe, followed in August 2016, blending classical arias with more contemporary material, including a cover of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. Then in 2020 came Going the Distance, a concept album recorded with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and filmed in Toronto, which became his first American television special and aired on PBS. That project included his first recorded performance of Nessun Dorma, Puccini's famous and famously difficult aria, a real statement piece for any tenor, and a sign of just how far his voice had matured since that shaky, nervous teenager first opened his mouth on a talent show stage. None of this success erased what came before it, and Jonathan has been unusually open about that over the years. He's spoken candidly about battling depression, a condition serious enough around the time of his BT debut that it forced him to cancel a scheduled performance at the Royal Albert Hall, one of the most prestigious stages in the world, abandoned because his mental health simply wouldn't allow him to go on. That's not a small thing to admit publicly, and it says something about how much pressure sat underneath all that early success. He's also talked about a difficult relationship in his late teens with a partner who struggled with serious mental health issues of her own, including self-harm that she didn't try to hide from him. For someone already carrying his own weight of anxiety and depression, being close to that kind of pain left real scars, even after the relationship ended. Through all of it, Jonathan has pointed to his family, his father John, his mother Tracy, and his older sister, also named Charlotte, as his real support system, the people who showed up consistently in a way the industry itself often couldn't. Rather than retreat from the subject, Jonathan leaned into advocacy, speaking openly about depression and getting involved in mental health awareness campaigns. He also co-wrote children's books, including one called Jonathan the Porcupine, built around anti-bullying themes, a fairly direct line back to his own childhood, turned into something he hoped might help other kids going through the same thing. Alongside the emotional struggles, Jonathan carried a lifelong difficulty with his weight, something he said was tied up with using food as comfort during the hardest stretches of his childhood. In the years around 2018 and 2019, while also managing a diagnosed thyroid condition, he decided to commit to real change. In 2022, not long after turning 27, Jonathan received a diagnosis that he later described as recontextualizing his entire life up to that point. He is autistic. He didn't go public with it immediately, choosing instead to sit with what it meant privately before eventually opening up about it. When he did share it, he described the experience honestly. The strange, almost dreamlike feeling of having years of memories suddenly make sense in a completely new light, and the slightly unsettling realization that a life already lived doesn't get to be relived with that new understanding built in from the start. For anyone who'd followed his story, the diagnosis clicked a lot of pieces into place. The intensity of his focus on music from such a young age, the difficulty he sometimes described in social situations, the particular way he processed both the bullying and the fame, all of it read differently once framed through that lens. In later interviews, Jonathan has spoken thoughtfully about neurodiversity in general, suggesting that most people exist somewhere along a spectrum of difference rather than in some purely typical category, and that understanding his own mind better gave him language to help other people understand theirs. Around the same period, Jonathan also underwent a significant physical transformation. Between roughly 2020 and 2024, he lost a substantial amount of weight, driven less by any external pressure and more by a genuine desire to feel healthier. He's talked about committing to walking 10,000 steps almost every single day, managing his thyroid condition properly, and rebuilding his relationship with food from the ground up. He's described feeling stronger and healthier than he had in a decade, crediting the change to a kind of discipline he'd previously only applied to his voice, now redirected toward his body. Fans who'd followed him since his teenage BGT audition responded warmly, less to the physical change itself and more to how honestly he talked about it. Not as some dramatic makeover story, but as a slow, deliberate process tied to his own well-being. These days, Jonathan Antoine is still making music, still touring, and still speaking openly about mental health, neurodiversity, and the anti-bullying causes close to his heart. He's continued releasing new material, moving fluidly between classical repertoire and more contemporary covers, and he remains close with his family while keeping most of his personal relationships fairly private. As for Charlotte Jaconelli, she moved from recording into musical theater, appearing in West End productions, and building her own separate career entirely apart from the crossover duo image that first made her famous. The two rarely cross paths these days, both having settled into lives that look very different from the teenage act that once stunned Simon Cowell into silence. There's also something worth noting about how Jonathan talks about his own rivalry with Ashley and Pudsey now, more than a decade on, rather than nursing any bitterness about losing to a dog act. He said in interviews that he genuinely admires what they went on to do, pointing out that their work with animals has probably done more tangible good in the world than most solo careers ever could. It's a strikingly generous way to look back at the single most painful moment of his early career, and it lines up with everything else he said about staying grounded. The idea that everyone above or below you in any given competition is, in the end, made of the same stuff. That's not the kind of perspective most 17-year-olds walk away with after losing on national television. It's the kind of perspective that tends to come later, after years of reflection and figuring out who you actually are underneath the noise of fame. It's also worth remembering just how unusual his path has been compared to most talent show alumni. Plenty of BGT contestants get a burst of attention, release one album riding the wave of their audition clip, and quietly fade once the cameras move on to the next series. Jonathan didn't follow that pattern. He built an actual sustained career spanning more than a decade, moved across continents to tour, collaborated with a full orchestra, earned the personal endorsement of one of opera's biggest living names, and kept releasing new material well into his 30s. That's not the trajectory of a novelty act. It's the trajectory of someone who happened to get discovered on a novelty-adjacent show, which is a very different thing. What makes Jonathan Antoine's story worth telling isn't really the viral audition, as extraordinary as it was. It's everything underneath it. A kid who was bullied for a decade before anyone gave him a real stage. A partnership that gave him confidence before it had to end so he could grow into himself. A very public loss that turned into one of the more unlikely success stories in reality television history. And a private diagnosis that finally gave him language for a lifetime of feeling slightly out of step with everyone around him. He didn't just survive the bullying, the loss on stage, the split, or the depression. He kept building through all of it, one album and one honest interview at a time. And that, more than any single talent show performance, is really what happened to Jonathan Antoine.